Hey, what's going on, guys? So this is going to be a crash course in asynchronous JavaScript. So we're basically going to cover a couple different things. I want to cover callbacks, promises, and also the async await syntax. Now, these are all ways to deal with asynchronous data. And what that means, basically, asynchronous is when something's going on, but you don't want to wait until that thing is done to continue your program. You want to continue while it's happening. So it's happening asynchronously rather than synchronous programming where something happens and you wait until it's completely finished until you move on to the next. Now, asynchronous programming is very relevant to JavaScript because we're often making requests to servers elsewhere, and it can take a couple seconds to get your data back, for instance, and you might not want your program to stall and wait for that data to come back. You want to keep going and keep doing something. So this is where callbacks come in, and callbacks were used for a long time until ES6 was released, or ES 2015, where promises were introduced to the language. And promises give you a more elegant way to handle asynchronous data. And then I think it was ES7, async await was introduced, which is still dealing with promises, just in a different way. You're dealing with the response in a way that's a little more elegant, and it looks more like synchronous programming rather than using the dot then and so on, if you guys have ever used promises. So we're going to cover all those things. Initially, I was going to do a separate video on them all, but I figured they're all relevant. We're actually going to use some of the same code for callbacks and promises, so you can see what you have to do to basically change it from a callback to a promise. We're also going to take a look at promise.all, where if you are resolving multiple promises, you can do that. Call them all at the same time and wait for each one to be done. And a lot of this code is actually from my Modern JavaScript from the Beginning course on Udemy. So if you're interested in 21.5-hour course on just vanilla JavaScript, just core concepts, building some projects, check that course out. I'll put a link in the description. All right, so let's get started here. I just have an index.html file. I have a callbacks.js and a promises.js, and we're going to start with callbacks. And you can see I just have, this should actually be callbacks down here. All right. So let's go over to callbacks.js, and what we're going to do is we're going to kind of mimic blog posts on a server and getting them and then creating a blog post. So we're just going to have an array. I'm going to call it posts, and we'll have an array of 2 posts. These are just going to be objects. So title, post 1, and body, we'll say this is post 1, and let's copy this down, and then we'll have one more post, so this will be post 2. And I realize that a lot of you guys might already know this stuff, but I like to create beginner to intermediate videos on my channel, so people just learning this stuff, it's really important. And I mean, there's not, in my opinion, there's not a lot of great resources out there to learn this type of stuff. At least videos. There's a lot of documentation, but a lot of people don't like reading documentation. So what we want to do here is create a function called getPosts. Okay, now remember, we're mimicking how it it is to fetch from a server, and that could take a couple seconds or whatever. So we're going to use set timeout here. Okay, set timeout is just, it takes in a callback function. So we could put a function in here, and then it takes in a certain amount of time where you want to delay whatever you put in here. So I'm going to delay it by a second. So we want 1000, which is 1000 milliseconds. Now you can use this syntax, or you can use an arrow function, which is what I'm going to do. So I'm going to remove the word function and just put in an arrow like that. Okay, we'll keep this ES6 style. So inside this set timeout, I'm going to, the purpose of this is to get these posts here and then put them on the page. So let's create a variable called output. We're just going to initialize it to nothing, and then we want to loop through the posts. So you could use like a for loop here if you want, but I'm going to use the high order for each method. So I'm going to say post dot for each. And then this actually takes in a callback as well. You could put function in here, but I'm just going to use an arrow function. And then as far as a parameter goes, I'm going to say post. This could be anything, but I'm going to call it post because that's what it is. You can also pass in an index if you want. And then for each post, we want to add it to the output variable. So let's say output, and we want to append. So I'm going to say plus equals, we'll use some backticks here so that we can use template syntax or template literal, whatever it is. And then we're going to just put in LIs here. And I want the post title, so I'm going to use this syntax so I can put a variable in. We'll take that post, which comes from this right here. So basically we're iterating through here, and then we can grab the title or the body. So I'm just going to grab the title, so post.title. And then right after the for each, not within it, but right after it, shit, sorry about that, guys. Sorry about that. So right after the for each, we want to just insert it into the body. So I'm going to say document.body.inner HTML. Doesn't really matter how we insert it here. And we're going to set that equal to the output. Okay, so we need to actually call this function for it to work. So we'll say get posts, and let's save. And then what happens is after a second, see, remember it's in a set timeout for a second, it's going to load the two posts. Okay, great. We get it here, the posts from the array, and then we're looping through, and then we're outputting them, or we're putting them into the output variable, and then outputting that onto the page with this line. All right, so pretty easy. Now let's create another function called create post. Okay, and this is going to take in a new post that we pass in, and we want to do a set timeout here as well, because remember we're hypothetically dealing with a server. So let's say set timeout, we'll put an arrow function here, and let's say this one takes 2 seconds, so 2000 milliseconds. And inside here, all I want to do is take posts, and I want to push on to the post array the new post, like that. So what do we want to happen? We want to get the post, and then we want to create a new one. That's it, right? So let's do it. Let's say create post, and let's pass in an object here with a title, and we'll just call it post 3, and the body, we'll say this is post 3. Okay, simple. We get the post, then we create the post. Save. Wait a minute. Unexpected token. Oh, I forgot the function. All right. So there we go. Post 1, post 2. Where is post 3? Now the reason that we're not seeing post 3 is because the create post took longer than the get post. The get post happened in 1 second. Okay, our server returned it in 1 second. The create post, however, took 2 seconds. But by the time we ran this create post, the DOM was already painted. Okay, so we can't do anything beyond that point. So this is where asynchronous programming comes in, and this is where callbacks come in, which is one way to handle it. So let's do that. Let's actually make this work by using a callback. So this create post here, what we would do is we would actually have this take in a function, and we'll call it callback. You could essentially call this anything, but this is common practice. And then we want that function to be called right after that post is pushed on. Okay, so right here we'll say callback like that. And then all we have to do is now make this get post this callback so that it runs right after this is pushed, not waiting 2 seconds for the entire function. So we can completely get rid of that and then add in a second parameter of get post like that. Okay, no parentheses. And let's save and see what happens. Okay, so what happened is it waited 2 seconds and then it showed all of the posts. And the reason it waited is because it had to wait to create the post before it actually called the callback. Okay, so it had to push onto it and then call the callback, and this whole thing took 2 seconds. But it adds the extra post. Okay, so this is a good example of how callbacks work and why you would use a callback. So let's now look at promises. Okay, and I'm going to basically use the same code or start with the same code. So we don't need the actual call here. So let's grab the posts and the 2 functions and let's put them into promises. All right, and let's change in index.html, we'll change this to promises.js. Okay, now the get posts we're just going to leave. Okay, we can leave that, but for create posts, what we want to do is instead of passing in a callback, we don't want to do that, and we don't want to run the callback. Instead, we want to return a promise. So to do that, we want to simply return a new promise. And then a promise takes in a callback. I'm going to use an arrow function. And it takes in 2 parameters. Okay, so it takes in resolve and reject. So basically, when you want to resolve a promise successfully, you call resolve. When something goes wrong, if you have some kind of error, you want to call reject. So we want to do the same functionality here that we did. We just want to put this inside the new promise like that. And to resolve, actually what I'm going to do is just create a variable called error, and I'm going to set it to false. Normally this would, you do some kind of error checking. You don't have to, but if you wanted to, you would do some kind of error checking. And let's see if that is not true. So if no error, then we simply want to resolve. We want to resolve our promise. Else, then we want to reject, and we want to send a message. We'll just say error. Something went wrong. Okay, and that's it. So let's go down here and let's call create post. Let's pass in our actual post. So we'll say title, post 3, and body. We'll say this. Whoops. This is post 3. Can't type. Okay, now we're not going to pass in a callback like get posts. We're not doing that anymore. This returns a promise, meaning that we can now use the .then syntax. So we can say .then, and then in here we want to pass in get posts like that. All right, so let's try and run it. So we'll save, and there we go. So basically it's waiting, it's setting the timeout, and then as soon as it's done, it's gonna resolve. Once it resolves, then it'll call get posts. Okay, now if we wanted an error message, like let's set error to true. So since error is set to true, it's going to reject. Now if I save this and run it, we get an uncaught promise, okay, or an uncaught error. So the solution for this, and you guys probably used this before, is .catch. So under the .then, we want to do .catch and pass in error. And then let's just console.log the error and save. And now you see that we get, whoops, I spelled that wrong. Something went wrong. Yeah, I can't spell, that's what went wrong. But now you can see that we're actually getting a nice clean error rather than just an uncaught promise or whatever. For the most part, in my experience, you're mostly going to be dealing with promises. So for instance, when you use the Fetch API or Axios or anything that uses promises, the Mongoose library for MongoDB for Node.js uses promises. You know, more and more libraries are using promises now. So you're mostly going to be dealing with the response rather than creating them yourselves, but you should also know how to create them yourself, which is just basically new promise. So what I want to do now is look at promise.all, because if you have a lot of different promises, you don't want to keep having .then. So you can use promise.all in that case. So I'm going to comment out this call, and let's go down here. Let's actually change the error back to false too. And let's look at promise.all. Okay, so let's just create a bunch of promises. We'll say const promise 1 equals new. Actually, we can just simply do promise dot resolve, Okay, as long as we resolve it, and we'll just say hello world. And then we could say promise 2. We could just set this to a variable like 10 if we wanted to. And then I'm just giving you different examples. We could say new, promise 3 equals new promise, and we could pass in function with resolve, reject, and let's set that to, let's do a set timeout. And we'll call resolve, and let's call that in 2000 milliseconds, and we'll just pass in goodbye. Okay, so now what we can do is we can call promise.all, and what this does is it takes in an array of promises. So we have 3 of these up here. Let's say promise 1, let's do promise 2, and promise 3, and then this will take a dot then. So we want to do a dot then and pass in here our callback. So we'll use an arrow function, and it will take in values like that. And then let's just console.log. Oops, we don't need that. Let's console.log values. All right, let's see what happens if I save this. All right, so what happened is it gave us back an array with the hello world. So the first promise, the second, which was just a number, and then this one, goodbye, which we actually set a timeout of 2000 or 2 seconds. And that's why it took 2 seconds to actually return everything. It's going to take however long the longest promise is. That's how long it's going to take to actually show us the values. All right, and just to add one more thing in here, let's say const promise 4. Now, I'm sure a lot of you guys have worked with the fetch API to make AJAX calls, or to make HTTP requests, I should say, which returns a promise. So let's fetch from, let's see, let's use the JSON typey code, or what is it? It's JSON placeholder.typeycode.com, and we can make a request to, let's say, the users right here and get these users. So I'm going to grab that URL and pass it in here. Now this returns a promise. Now fetch is a little weird because what happens is you need to do 2 dot thens when you use fetch, because you first need to format it, usually to JSON, and then the next dot then will actually give you the data. So if I keep it as is and I pass in promise 4 and save, it's going to work. But if we look at the response here, we just get like this weird stuff. What we want to do is, for fetch, we want to do dot then, and we want to map the response to res.json like that. And now if we run it, it should give us the actual data, which you can see right here is going to be 10 users. All right, so that's promise.all, pretty easy. Now let's look at Let's see. Let's look at async await. Okay, so I'm going to comment this out. And we don't want to change any of this stuff. I mean, async await, it's a way to handle responses. It's not like a different way to write them or anything. Basically, we need to have a function that's labeled asynchronous. So let's go down here. Actually, we'll go above this because this promise.all has nothing to do with the code above it. Let's say async await. All right, so what we want to do is create a function, and I'm just going to call it init. Now, this function has to be labeled async if we want to use await inside of it. And await does just that. It waits for an asynchronous process or action to complete. So what we'll do is we'll call create post. Okay, so I'm just going to copy this here without the dot then. Just simply the create post with the title and the body passed in, except we want to call right before it await. Okay, and then after that we can just simply call get posts. So we're waiting for this to be done until we move on and call this. So now we just need to call init. And let's save, and we should see them pop up on the screen, and there we go. All right, so that's how async await works. It's just a more elegant way to handle promises. Now, if we wanted to use it, like let's say with fetch, we could do that as well. So I'll go ahead and comment that out. And let's go down here. Let's say async await with fetch. Okay, so let's copy what we did here. Just grab that. And we're going to need an async function. Let's just call this, we'll say function fetch data or fetch users. And then we want to call that fetch, except we want to put this into a variable. And let's call it response or res and set it to await fetch, because remember this returns a promise. Now again, the fetch API is a little weird because the first promise it returns is we're gonna need to call res.json on that. So what we would do is create another variable called data and set it to await and then res.json like that, and then we could console log the data. So let's save that, and it's not going to do anything because we didn't call it. So let's call fetch users and save, and there we go. So we should get 10 users. Okay, so it's just a cleaner way of dealing with promises instead of doing the dot then and all that stuff. And especially with fetch, it makes it look even nicer. We just have these variables and everything is just one after another. There's no dot then or dot, whatever. And it's cleaner than callbacks as well.